Okay, hello, Year 8. This is Mr. Hinchliffe again for our fifth lesson in history this term, where we're looking at the relationship between Africa and Europe and whether it has always been the same. I just want to start off like I did last week with some really, really great pieces of work that have been sent through to me. So the first one to consider here, this is Divine. Yeah, this is Divine in 8D, and Miss Mattin sent me this, and it's just to kind of highlight the fantastic analysis that has been provided here by Divine, which last week we were asking what was the main reasons for the start and development of the transatlantic slave trade, which is what we're going to look at pretty much after February half term, really, the main ideals of the slave trade. So I can see straight away that Divine was able to read through the factors, identify, and clearly economic was a big factor. And actually, that was her analysis. So Divine argued this was the driving factor. And what was really, really great was she identified that it was the Spanish and Portuguese had begun to trade African slaves to make money from sugar, which made huge profits, as we know later on with Barbados. And this was the line I particularly liked. This caught the eye of the British, who then began to capture their own slaves, and other countries started to follow in the same footsteps. So the slave trade developed due to these economic factors of other European nations wanting a piece of the action, really, a slice of the cake. She's then argued that the political factors triggered it. So John Hawkins was triggered by seeing the wealth of Spain and Portugal linking to the economic factors, and that the racial factors were a contributing factor. The fact that it wasn't the main cause of the slave trade, so racial reasons was not the main reason, but as it progressed, and that's a really good point from her, it played a role in progressing it. As we know, the Barbados Slave Code kind of completely stripped away any ideals of equality for West Africans who became slaves, and slavery was seen as a more racial thing, and a hierarchy and an inferior race aspect came into play as well. So really fantastic analysis from Divine. Furthermore, Matas as well in AE again, he's gone through and done a really good job of highlighting the relevant factors. And his analysis is not as detailed, but he still makes some really, really great points. Ultimately, this idea of the economy being the driving factor again, and it was the best way through business, and successful ones use slaves. And he's completely correct. The slave colony on Barbados, and the same with the Canary Islands with the Portuguese, made vast amounts of money due to their trading of slaves. Political factors promoted slavery, but it wasn't the biggest effect. A really good analysis there. Again, it triggered it. King Charles II creates the Royal Africa Company. He makes it grow because he sees the economic benefits, but it kind of triggers him to do it because of the economic benefits. And then finally, Matas argues that racial factors sped up the development of the slave trade. And I think it's a really good point, particularly with the Barbados Slave Code, and he's kind of there mentioned that a little bit, talking about future children would be slaves as well. So really excellent, guys. Really, really fantastic work. Thanks, Mrs. Green, for sending that through to me from Matas. Okay, so your lesson this week is going to be entirely on Microsoft Forms. So it'll be really easy for you to access. It'll be easy for you to complete as well, whether you're using a laptop, computer, or even a phone, because this is what it will look like on your phone as well. So it's really easy to access that. So I'm just going to kind of talk you through what you have to do. This is ultimately an assessment preparation. So next week we'll assign you an assessment on forms as well, just to kind of show what you've learned about this inquiry, about the relationship between Africa and Europe. So I'm going to explain what you have to do quite briefly. So you're going to be sent a PowerPoint document as well, which is going to have this timeline on it, just so you can see it far easier too, so you can access both, just because some of the images are a bit small on here. And the first thing is just checking your knowledge, really. So here's a big timeline of everything we've covered in the last 4 weeks. We can see we've covered a lot of time, and we go from the late 4th century, so the late 300s with the Romans, all the way through to 1688, and each year or period of time is represented through an image. So what you need to do is, there are 13 images in total, I believe. 13. You need to identify through multiple choice which the correct representation is showing. So for question 1, it says, for the time period the late 4th century, so here it is, you look at the arrow, it's pointing at this image here and this image here. So if you want to see it a little bit more, a little easier, you can see it on this document here. Yep. You need to argue what it's representing. Now, it might not always be the exact accurate piece of knowledge. It might be more it's about representing, so it could show a number of things, but some questions might have multiple correct answers. So it's about you trying to find the best accurate answer, really, but some have multiple answers, so you're not always going to be wrong. So for this, for example, is it the African presence in Britain during the Roman era? Is it showing Mary Phyllis, or is it showing the Ivory Bangle Lady? It is the Ivory Bangle Lady, so that actually would be a correct answer. However, you'd probably argue that as a representation, it best shows that there was an African presence in Britain during the Roman era, because you might remember there was the Beachy Head woman as well. So I would probably go for that one, although the Ivory Bangle Lady would be correct. It's not as accurate as this one here. Okay, so that's what you need to do as you go through the other questions as well. Just really consider what's the best representation of the image on the timeline. It's going to be you trying to work out what it shows. So this has a crown, it has a cross, something to do with a religious king. This has chains that represent slavery. You've got the flags of 2 nations here as well. You've got to work out what it is. Wedding rings, cross, money, chains, something to do with the law, something to do with chains and slavery again. So it's about you working out what the image is meant to be showing. One thing I will point out, which I think is really helpful on forms, and you might not have used this feature before, is the immersive reader. So if you are someone who likes to be read questions, even like audiobooks, this is really helpful for you, and you can use it on the mobile site as well. So it's shown by this image, a little book with the little kind of mute sign there as well, and it will come up saying immersive reader when you select on it, and you can do it for every single question. So if you select that, it will actually read the question for you. So I'll just show how it works. So it loads it up, has the question, it's in bigger writing as well if you prefer that, and what it'll do is it will read the question for you. So we'll have a listen to it.
1. For the time period late 4th century, the image is representing 1 point. African presence in Britain during the Roman era. Mary Phyllis. The Ivory Bangle Lady. End of question. Close the reader to input your answer.
Okay, so once you've heard it, and you can play it again if you want, you can simply just press the exit button here, and then you're back to the main screen where you can put in your answer. So again, it will work the exact same way for the mobile device as well. It will bring it up the exact same way if you're using your phone for this. Okay, so that's the first part of the lesson. So you go through all of them. What you can do now is you can either pause the video and move on to section 2, or just continue and this is the whole video first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just select, because I have to get to the next section, select an answer to get to the next section. As you can see, these are all mandatory with the asterisks. So these aren't necessarily the right answers. You'll need to make sure you take time to go through them, just so I can click next. Okay, and here's the last part of the lesson. So in your assessment, you will need to identify the key turning points in the African-European relationship. So think about what a turning point is. A turning point is when an event happens and everything changes after that. It has a huge impact. I always think of the football analogy in a game. If there's a red card and a player gets sent off, that often is quite a bit of a turning point, isn't it? Because the opposition might change their tactics, the team that are now down to 10 players also have to change their tactics as well. So it completely changes the outcome. And that's what happens in history. Certain events take place. It's a turning point. Things completely change. Yeah. So what you will need to do is in the next two boxes is you have to identify what you think was the biggest turning point with this relationship between Africa and Europe. So what I advise you to do is to use the timeline. So again, I will send the timeline out as well, or Mrs. Green will, and use that to help you to think, right, when did the relationship between Africa and Europe completely change? Okay, it doesn't have to be negative, it doesn't have to be positive. And just briefly, as it says, briefly explain your answer here. So write down the event. So you might just write down, you believe that the Barbados slave code was the biggest turning point, and then because. Yeah, so whatever you think was that reason. Then what I'd like to do is consider when was the relationship the most positive. So when was actually the relationship between Africa and Europe, good? When were they on good terms? And just explain your answer there. So which event on the timeline, and then finally, when was it at its most negative, and then just explain why you think that as well. That's all you need to do. So this is just prepping you for some key knowledge and for you to start to think about what you think was the biggest turning point. Next week, we will set you the assessment on forms again, so we can then mark that, and your teachers, history teachers, can then mark that and give you some feedback as well. Okay, hope that's been helpful. Please get in touch if you are struggling with anything, and I'll speak to you next time. Thank you. Bye.